organisations moving beyond that. And the first thing I want to talk about is if we're trying to identify the things that are relevant to help us, or if we're trying to identify the things that might be important to autistic people more broadly in terms of public policy, we need to not fall into the autism trap. Now, in England, we've had terrible trouble with this. The National Autistic Society loves to say at every opportunity that the Autism Act that they got passed was the first disability-specific, blah, 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 blah. What's the Autism Act say? The government has to write a strategy. That's it. That's the entire act. They did that. And has one single autistic person's life actually been changed in any meaningful way? No, not really. It's very similar, yeah? That there's a lot of talk and much of it doesn't really mean anything. So if you're trying to identify what rules might govern things that matter to you, or you're trying on behalf of other autistic people generally to think about what affects autistic people, you need to think well beyond autism. What really impacts on autistic people's lives? Well, this one's not talked about nearly as much as it should be. The right to make our own decisions. Many of us may never have had that right challenge, but there are many, many other autistic people right across Europe who have that privilege of being an adult taken away from them, who are judged legally to lack legal capacity to make their own decisions in adult life. Physical health care. Autistics are at much higher risk of a huge range of conditions. There's research data on early mortality, so health inequalities are important. Mental health care. Mental health issues are much more common in autism. This is relevant. It's also where you'll find most of the law that enables states to put people in institutions and keep them there. Social care. Now, what this is called will vary a lot from country to country. Hetter's translation earlier was disability services. Whatever it is in your country that is not health, but supports disabled people to do everyday living things. That's what I mean by social care, because that's what we call it in the UK. Education. Yeah? For our children growing up, autistic children in the future, but also into adult life. What is there in terms of education? Money, benefits, welfare systems, changes to those rules will affect us. Law enforcement, the criminal justice system. Yeah, some autistics are affected by that more than ought to be. And of course, employment has cropped up quite a lot in discussion. And there may even be other social policy areas. So if you want to make sense of what services might be relevant to autistic people in your country, you need to look at all of those. But it also helps to have some foundation knowledge about how rules and laws work. So I'm going to do my best in terms of pan-European understanding to explain that, because many of the core ideas are much the same right across European jurisdictions. So human rights. We have the European Convention on Human Rights. Okay, that's extremely important. We've also had mention earlier of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, although I will say some more about that later. In many countries, there will be some equality or anti-discrimination legislation. That's the legislation that governs things like whether people have to make reasonable adjustments. Most countries, the UK is a rare exception, have a written constitution or some kind of clear place in which citizens' rights are set out. And there's also a useful little thing which most people have never heard of, called public law principles. These exist right across Europe. There are some common principles which are present in EU law, principles like proportionality, principles like due process following the rules. Knowing about where to find those things in your country is really crucial to working out what the rules are and whether you can enforce them. So it's important to know about those. But it's also important to look at all those various areas that you've identified and find out as best you can in your country what laws there are in that area. Are there any autism-specific rules? Is there a policy or a strategy? Read it. Get some analysis going of whether it actually is worth the paper it's written on and what it really means. Mental capacity laws, rules about guardianship, that's where you'll find the stuff about people's right to make their own decisions. Mental health laws, very important because they're often the basis for detaining people. It's an area of laws to be aware of, often called things like adult protection, vulnerable adults, safeguarding adults. Autistic people are remarkably often affected by these sets of laws. Social work, social care, disability services, who's entitled to those? Where do you find the rules for those? Children's law or child protection, that's likely to be relevant for autistic children and of course autistic parents. And education. Now, you could go on and on with this list, but in each of these areas, I would recommend doing some Googling, having a search on your government's websites, looking for laws in that area, buying a book about laws or policies in that area in your country. If you start doing that for all these different areas, you'll rapidly learn a lot more than you knew in the first place about laws that are relevant to us. But once you've found a law, it helps to understand what kind of law it is. Now, this is basically a ranking system. And exactly how it works is very slightly different in different countries, but basically most legal systems have some sort of primary legislation. Yeah, so in England that's Acts of Parliament. In lots of continental European countries it would be the Civil Code, something of that nature. Yeah, whatever exists at your national level, passed by parliaments, and also, of course, for most countries, EU law. Then there's something called secondary legislation, also often called delegated legislation, regulations, things like that. Those are lower down forms of law, but they're often where the detail is. Sometimes they're where the rules on who qualifies for what are. So it's a very useful form of law to hunt down. Then, depending on the jurisdiction, there's stuff below that. In England and other common law jurisdictions, there's case law. Even in civil law jurisdictions, European Court of Human Rights case law and European Court of Justice case law may be relevant. Policies, local legislation. So working out what there are of those is very helpful. But once you've found all these rules, you'll quickly come across the problem that was coming up in the discussion earlier. Well, what point is there in knowing all these rules if nobody's actually following them? This is one of the hardest things. Is the law being enforced? That's an important thing to consider, because just because you found a law that says they've got to do this doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be able to get somebody to do that unless you know how that would need to be enforced, yeah, and how possible that is. That may lead you into figuring out why something isn't happening even though the law says it should. Because in most countries, what actually happens in practice is that the officials don't necessarily know what the law says. Even if they do know what the law says, they often don't have the money to do what the law says. And quite often, the groups of people who are affected don't have the knowledge, skills, or support or access to advice to take action to actually enforce the law. So finding out those things is a huge help. So the legal route is one route to changing things and getting stuff done. If there is a law that says this should happen, look at, is it enforceable? How could we enforce it? Would that make a difference? And that might be how you influence it. If you know that a public body has, or you think a public body has made a wrong decision, so you've asked them for support and they've said no, and you think that decision's wrong, there are three basic kinds of routes to disagreeing and arguing, okay? The best route is an appeal, but the problem with this is that lots of decisions that actually get taken by officials, there isn't a route of appeal. So an appeal is when you can put in an appeal and somebody will actually look at whether the decision was right or wrong or not, yeah? If you've got one of those, then great, appeal, that's a good thing to do. But a lot of the decisions that we're concerned with, there is no appeal. There are two other things. There are complaints, sometimes going to someone like an ombudsman. Complaint systems just let you say, you messed up the paperwork here somewhere, you made a mistake, you've taken too long about it, that kind of thing. What it won't do is look at whether the decision was right, it'll just look at whether somebody made some obvious mistakes with the paperwork. The other route you've got is something called a judicial review. Most systems have something like this in administrative law. That's when you can go to a court, but the court won't look at whether the decision was right, the court will just look at whether the decision was made by following the right rules. And even if the court decides that they did it wrong or it was unlawful, all the court can do is say, make it again. And the trouble with that is they may then make the same decision. So those are your three routes of challenge when the law is good, but you need to enforce it. But in many areas, you haven't necessarily got the right law in the first place. You need to get a change of policy. You need the government to make a new law or a new policy. To do that, you need to figure out how policies are actually developed. Who gets a say? And when the government publishes a nice, new, shiny policy, does anybody actually follow it? If not, why not? What actually does make a difference on what people do? So at the top of the policy process, how new policies are developed, it's worth mapping who might be getting a say. What are the relevant organisations? Professionals organisations, ones that register professionals, regulatory bodies. So people like, again, I'm afraid my knowledge of other countries is not fabulous. In the UK, the General Medical Council, who disciplines doctors who break the rules, that sort of thing. Inspectorates, who goes and inspects services and says, are they good or are they rubbish? Yeah? They're a relevant voice in that discussion. Unions, representative bodies who stand up for professionals in a particular sector, they have a loud voice. They often influence policy. various other public sector lobbying representative bodies. There are lots of those representing all sorts of interests in society. In many areas these days we have lots of outsourcing and lots of quangos, which is short for quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. Sorry, Heta. Basically, governments in recent years have shoved everything out to arm's length as much as they can. So they say, oh, it's not us, not our problem. We didn't do it, it's over there. But it's still just bits of government, really. And the big charities in the disability sector. We may not like them, but they're there, they have a loud voice. Also, parent-carer organisations and groups, they may also have a voice in debates, especially to do with autism. So, mapping that structure will give you an idea of how new policies are developed at the sort of governmental level. But the trouble is, as the question asked earlier pointed out, even if you've got laws and you've got shiny new policies, sometimes none of that makes any difference to what actually happens. So it helps to also start at the bottom. And the way I have of doing this is starting with the actual situation that you're concerned about, asking yourself what affects this person or organisation's decision making. So, an example. Suppose you don't like the way care staff treat autistic service users in a service. They tend to treat autistic people like children and boss us around and tell us what to do, and maybe they're restraining people a lot. Okay, you don't like their behaviour. What's motivating their behaviour? Well, number one motivation in any job for most people is don't annoy the boss. So likely they're behaving in the way they're behaving because of the pressures on them, what their boss is telling them to do, what their management's priorities are. So that might be to provide care with fewer staff, to get things done more efficiently. Where did the management get their priorities from? What's affecting their decision making? Well, if they're a private commercial organisation, making money very often, commercial success, growing the business. In these days of outsourcing, this is a common factor. But how do they achieve commercial success? On what does it depend whether people buy their care service? Well, mostly reputation. What affects their reputation amongst their customers, whether those customers are local authorities or parents or somebody like that? Well, usually the inspection reports. Yeah, an inspectorate goes in and says, this is a good care service, this one's rubbish. And that's why people pick that care service. So, who put them in charge? Where did they get their rules from? Well, then you have to go up to the politicians. They set down those regulations that decided what the inspectors were looking for. Why did they do that? 9 times out of 10, because there was a moral panic. Because at some point there was a scandal. So in the UK we had Winterbourne View. Yeah, there have been many since. Ghastly story of a vile amount of institutional abuse of autistic people in a closed institution. And the press was up in arms. So the government passed some laws and wrote some policies. And trickle down. That's why you've got care workers behaving towards autistic people like that. So this sort of top-down and bottom-up process can help you work out what really is affecting stuff and what's not. But it also helps to look for the knowledge that you can't acquire from books to fill in the gaps. This business about practice experience, also called clinical experience in healthcare. How do you get that, especially if you can't actually do it? Well, There are trade and specialist publications in just about every area of employment. Read the magazines and journals that the social workers read, that the doctors read, that the teachers read. That will tell you an awful lot about what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. It's also worth, especially if you're trying to understand whether the law is actually being enforced in practice and what affects that, to look at decisions of courts and tribunals to see how well the rules are actually working in practice. But the hardest kind of knowledge for many autistic people is actually figuring out the difference between the theory and the rules about how things are supposed to be done and the reality of how things actually are done. Listen to the professionals, actually. They are a very useful source of knowledge. They'll often tell you quite a lot. Other people are a useful source of knowledge. The more autistic people come together in organisations and we get a feel for, is this experience that I've had common amongst the community, or is this just something that happened to me? Do your research. Go and sit in the back of a court, listen to a few cases. Book yourself on a training course designed for professionals. Read reports. Governments and quangos absolutely love writing reports. Okay, there are loads of them. They come out all the time. Get yourself on email lists that they issue the reports to. And also a certain amount of trial and error. I did that. Did it work? Has it solved the problem? If not, why didn't it work? Why was this ineffective at resolving the problem? Analyse that. It's also important to seek advice and feedback from other autistic people. Read and research, but also avoid reinventing the wheel. Has somebody already suggested that? Has somebody already tried that? Did it work? Why not? So, you do all of that, but then you actually need to bring all that massive amount of knowledge together and analyse it. How do laws get made in your country? How are laws changed if they're wrong? How are laws enforced, if they are? Who by? How consistently? Can people get funding? Can people get advice to challenge things? What else influences people's practice? Inspection frameworks, performance measures, targets. Those are very important in many people's jobs. Professional standards, best practice guidance. Do these actually affect what professionals do? So once you've done all of that pulling together of knowledge, then can we be effective with it? Well, we have to be realistic about our resources as a community and as individuals. You can't fight every battle all of the time, especially when a lot of us are working quite hard just to function and survive in life. So we have to be strategic, and that means deciding which battles are not worth fighting. What's not important enough? What is important, but there's no realistic chance of success? What is important and there's a realistic chance of success, but is going to be too stressful or we haven't got the resources to manage it? You're going to have to cross an awful lot of things off your list. What should the priority be right now? Well, obviously, for most people, the priority is being able to function themselves. Once you've achieved that, if you can achieve it, what should we be looking at collectively? Well, I would want to encourage people to look at what would actually have the most important impacts, not just on our own individual circumstances, but on autistic lives more broadly. I've pushed for many years, and it's why I'm involved with the National Autistic Task Force in the UK, for autistic people who are more verbal to interest ourselves and involve ourselves in things that may not directly affect us. There are very, very serious human rights abuses happening to autistic people all over Europe. And they have to do with losses of fundamental legal rights through systems like guardianship, compulsory detention, and treatment. Some members of our community you know may have experienced some of those things. Others who we may not be in contact with also do. Access to healthcare. The mortality statistics for autistics are pretty scary. Access to support. The core issue that I was getting out of the previous discussion was one that's very familiar to me. The importance of trying to enable public services and professionals working in those services to understand the autistic paradox and the fact that in autism it's not at all uncommon for people to be very able in some respects and still also very disabled in other respects. Inequality or discrimination, are these your biggest issues? If so, in what environments? Is that in healthcare, education, employment? When you're trying to work out what to do, I would also watch out for what I would call the research spiral. Lots of autistic people are interested in research about autism. But for some people that's great, it may be their obsessive interest, but in terms of its actual usefulness in changing real world, well, we need to be a bit wary of that, because a lot of research these days is essentially about furthering people's academic careers and not very much about actually affecting people's lives. So if we're involving ourselves and putting a lot of resources into research, does that research have a practical application? Is it likely to be useful in actually solving real world problems? Having done all that, it's worth looking out for opportunities to influence things. Timing's important. Once we've mapped all the issues and we've worked out what our priorities are, is this the moment to speak about it? What are on other people's agendas? What is currently being talked about? Do we have any allies here? We may not especially like some other organisations, but we may need to be pragmatic about when our agendas are actually pretty similar. Identifying the most significant things to focus on. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. Identifying the positive change. So this is a typical autistic difficulty. We're very, very good at identifying what is not going well, what's wrong. But actually influencing stuff works better if we can also say, and this is how you solve it. What actually motivates people? Making sure we've figured those out. Realism, I'm going to talk some more about that in a minute, but working out what we can actually realistically change and what we can't. And having more than just an idea, seeking advice, developing a coherent proposal, and planning your tactics. So if you want to change something, you need more than just an idea. You need to be able to answer questions like, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to actually do it? How much time and effort is this going to take? How do you get known, get a voice? Well, writing, speaking, contributing to professional discussions in an area helps. It also helps to be useful. I found this one very successful over the past couple of years. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I'm on the steering group for the Government Capabilities Framework for Workforce Development, and this was setting out all of the capabilities that people needed about autism. And not surprisingly, because it was talking about social work and health, there were a lot of references to law in there. But this wasn't written by lawyers, so I went through the entire draft of it and spent about a day and a half correcting all the errors and providing detailed legal references throughout. and fixing all the things that autistic people would like to be worded differently and have additional emphasis, all of which just got completely taken for granted because the legal stuff was really useful. If you want to get a public voice, it helps to be a group. It helps to be a properly constituted group, to know what your structure is, and be clear about whether you are seeking to represent your autistic community or whether you are not representative. Be reliable. Be careful about how realistic you can be, what you can actually do, what promises you can keep and what you can't. Take other people with you. Refer and recommend. Yeah? When somebody asks you to do something, are you actually the right person for that job? Do you know another autistic person who's better qualified, who'd be good at that? Yeah? Credibility. In my experience, this is where, unfortunately, I think we often mess it up. It's really, really hard to be credible when you're trying to speak in a public policy forum. It's important to develop your self-awareness. Find out, research, get advice on how neurotypical people may see you. Common pitfalls would be our tendency to talk too much. My chronic tendency to interrupt far too much. The fact that we're maybe not necessarily great at considering other people's point of view. Important to work very hard on those things. Providing more than just ideas. Yes, I've got an idea for how to fix this. Great. Is it realistic? How long will it take? Where will the money come from? And who's going to do it? It helps to not come out with ideas in public until you've done all that thinking. That gives you credibility. Identify where your knowledge comes from. How do you know what you know? Are you basing this on your own personal experience? That's fine, but say so. Are you basing it on collective autistic experience? If you are, if you possibly can, for goodness sake, do a survey. We've known for 15 years that autistic people have terrible trouble using the phone. But a couple of years ago, Dr. Mary Doherty did a questionnaire at Autistic, and now she's just about to publish this, so all of a sudden it's official. Autistic people have trouble using the phone. Are you talking about your own research? Do you have formal qualifications in that? Are you accredited, attached to a university? Do you know this from reading research? Are you qualified to do that? How comprehensive or balanced is the picture you can provide? Do you have your own professional practice experience of this problem? Are you talking about how professionals experience this problem generally? In which case, how do you know? Are you quoting an authoritative source? There is a massive difference, believe me, in being in a meeting and saying, well, I think that's against human rights, and being in a meeting saying, well, I think you'll find if you look in section 1B of such and such in the Human Rights Act that it actually says, very, very big difference. Prioritization and realism are also very important to being credible. I know I've only got a minute or two, so I'm going to whiz through this in quite a hurry. I knew this was too much stuff to get in, sorry. So, if you're banging on about an issue that affects only you and no one else, you're not likely to be credible. If you can't say what you could change, you're not likely to be credible. Think about what the point is. What is it that the state's trying to achieve here? Will what you're proposing actually achieve that? Will the people who would have to implement it actually do it? Are the costs realistic? Can you give some sort of rationale why it would be? And is it politically achievable? Or is a government who tries this going to get voted out at the next election? Offering solutions also makes you more credible. But do your homework. What's already been tried? Why hasn't that worked? Has anyone else developed or suggested a solution that you can support? Balance. Big, important one for credibility. Show that you've considered what's wrong with your proposal and what's good about other people's. And if possible, offer more than one solution. None of this should matter, but it does. Approach the right person, use the right language, wear the right clothes. Yeah, I know this is ridiculous, but Autistic Run conferences are the only place I present wearing jeans and trainers. Yeah, managing to shut up, trying to listen to other people, all that kind of stuff. Being organised, having the right papers, turning up when you've said you will, responding to people's emails, understanding when you're getting it wrong. Money, what's the going rate for things, charging the right price, know when to do things for free and when not to, and be a competent organisation and follow the rules. So, I'm going to skip my last few slides, but essentially it just goes into some more detail on most of what I've covered. So I'm just going to jump to my summary. Essentially, think beyond autism. Try and identify more broadly what's important. Map the law and policy in your country. Develop relevant knowledge and expertise. Think about your targeting. What's worth trying to influence? How are you going to do it? Think of all your things to consider there. Consider your credibility. What would be effective in getting you listened to? And when people do offer you stuff, evaluate that critically. Questions to ask yourself: what's the point? How many people does this affect? How significant an impact does this have on people's lives? Will what I'm proposing realistically bring about change? If so, how? What's it cost? Why would people buy into this proposal and be willing to do it? Who is accountable for this? Once you've got answers to those kinds of questions, then you can make decisions about what to do and take much more effective actions. Ready overrun. I'm quite happy for people to grab me. I will also be doing a workshop tomorrow. Please do come to that and actually have a go at mapping your local systems, and we can talk some more then. Okay? Thanks very much.